Welcome to the podcast. I'm Angela Bobier, and this is Life in the Talbot Settlement, brought to you by Tyrconnell Heritage Society, operators of Backus-Page House Museum. In this series, we will do our best to give you a full appreciation of the history of Western Elgin County in southwestern Ontario, from First Nations to the early settlers to the 1950s. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge funding from Tyrconnell Heritage Society, operators of Backus-Page House Museum. Welcome to episode 28 in our podcast, Life in the Talbot Settlement. Today is a rather intriguing episode. We'll be talking about the crimes, scandals, and tragedies that have occurred in the Talbot Settlement. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge funding from the Department of Canadian Heritage and Tyrconnell Heritage Society, operators of Backus-Page House Museum. Before we get started, I'd like to give a heads up that this particular episode may get a bit graphic in detail. If you get a little squeamish at injuries or death, then this episode might not be for you. With that being said, let's get into this week's episode. Murder is a very serious crime and is extremely punishable in almost every country. Thus, a person convicted of murder receives a harsh punishment, usually a long-term sentence to prison, for the retribution and rehabilitation of the guilty. In Canada, prior to 1961, any person convicted of murder was subject to the death penalty. When the abolition of the death penalty came into place in 1976, mandatory life in prison became the sentencing for all murderers. Here in the Talbot Settlement, many settlers have taken their last breath at the gallows. Today, we will be looking at some of the historic scandals, murders, and crimes that have taken place in our area. Some information in this episode is from the highly recommended book, Sim's History of Elgin County. There's a series of 3 books. The first murder we will be discussing is what is known as the Mount Salem Massacre. Mount Salem was a quiet community in Malahide Township of Elgin County. That changed on the 12th of October in 1942. The affair started on the farm of Fred Loeb over the sale of a cow. This cow belonged to Fred and was sold by Loeb's adopted son Herbert for $50. Loeb went into a rage after discovering his cow had been sold without his knowing and stabbed Herbert in the chest. Loeb, trying to stab him a second time, instead stabbed his wife, who was trying to protect their adopted son. Herbert managed to break free and run down the road to the Hawley farm. The Hawleys then called the police and a doctor. When the police arrived, they waited across the road at the Hawley farm and took watch of Loeb's property. While doing so, a car with 3 men rode into the Loeb laneway and got out of the vehicle. Fred, thinking it's the police, fired point blank at the men without giving them a chance to identify themselves. Seeing the relentless actions of Mr. Loeb, the police called for reinforcements and continued watching the house. That was until around midnight, when Mrs. Loeb left the house and informed the police that Fred had left at 8:45 p.m. Mrs. Loeb was scared to come out and notify them in fear that Fred was lurking outside and would shoot her. Police began searching the property. When nearing the blacksmith shop, the constable was shot in the leg. A second shot was fired and hit the sergeant in the face and hands. Police surrounded the building with their guns ready. A squad was set up with a machine gun pointed straight at the blacksmith shop, and they waited. At 1:30 a.m., an unexpected explosion came from within, then followed by silence. Fred Loeb had shot himself in the stomach by pressing the trigger with a notched stick. The 6-hour drama resulted in the death of 3 men, an injury of many officers, and 2 of Fred's own family. I've been saying their last name as Loeb, but it is possible that it's pronounced Lob, so I do apologize if I've pronounced it incorrectly. Our next story is a secret love affair and the grave consequences of that affair. Samuel Mitchell was the proprietor of the Lawrence Hotel in Lawrence Station for a couple of years. In 1880, Mitchell, his wife Sarah, and their 2 daughters located to Port Bruce. While living at the small port town, a man named Alexander McIntosh came into their lives. What they didn't know was that Alexander would be in amongst the background for many years to come. Mr. McIntosh took a special liking towards Sarah Mitchell, who also had shared feelings. Mr. Mitchell left his job at Lawrence Station and decided to move to Elmer and operate a new hotel, in which he hired McIntosh as the bartender. The affair between McIntosh and Mitchell's wife continued, unbeknownst to the rest of the world. By 1884, Mitchell moved to St. Thomas and became a teamster for Reiser's Brewery. Mr. McIntosh, feeling bold, took up residency in their house as a boarder. At this point, Samuel Mitchell had begun to get a little suspicious and suspected something was happening behind his back. For quite some time, the thought plagued him. When complained to his mother, Samuel said he couldn't stand it any longer. After discovering his suspicions were correct, Mitchell had had enough. He shot and killed his wife's lover. Samuel Mitchell was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 10 years in the penitentiary. He served his time, got out, and returned home to his previous job. Next, we're going to discuss the horrific murder of the herb doctor at Hogs Hollow. Hogs Hollow was a small community on the southwestern outskirts of St. Thomas. Dr. Needham was of First Nations descent and was an excellent herb doctor. One day, Needham and his son Murray, who was identical to his father with great strength and knowledge, were attending the Wallacestown Fair. They had a booth set up for selling their herbs. George Lipsey and Harold Fitzsimmons, full of whiskey, started to pick a fight with the young boy. Murray defended himself and gave them a great beating. The fight left Fitzsimmons with a scar on his face shaped like the letter Z. This scar would later help identify the man. Lipsey swore to Murray that they would get even, and the two battered men left the fair. Dr. Needham and his son were planning on heading to Stirling after their time in Wallacestown. The two revengeful men had learned of this information and decided to follow them. Lipsey and Fitzsimmons hid in the bushes at Kettle Creek Crossing, awaiting the passing of Needham's wagon. Somehow the men didn't see the wagon stop and drop off Murray at the bridge. When they recognized the wagon, they noticed it was tied up at the Mitchells. With this, they set out to fulfill their promise. Lipsey and Fitzsimmons jumped on the wagon and threw the doctor off, not being able to tell their victim was Dr. Needham and not his son Murray. Lipsey held the innocent man down while Fitzsimmons, with a sack containing pork and an axe head, beat the doctor. The men fled, and the police and local militia were called upon to search for the killers. The area was so shaken, they called upon the provincial government, who notified Detective Johnson Wilson Murray. Word arose that Fitzsimmons was seen in Red Wing, Minnesota. The detective proceeded to Red Wing. Identified by his scar, Fitzsimmons was captured and brought back to the settlement. He confessed to his crimes in St. Thomas and was sentenced to the penitentiary for 10 years. He would later die while serving his sentence. As for Lipsey, he was killed in a circus row in the western part of the United States. Son Murray Needham later died in 1902 after a fistfight with a man in London. Tragedy struck Wardell Woods on December 14, 1894. John Hendershot, uncle of the victim, grew tired of his lifestyle and the limitations of poverty. His solution to the predicament was to gain money by the sudden death of someone who was heavily insured. Mr. Hendershot believed he needed an accomplice in order for his plan to be successful. Hendershot managed to convince his boarder, William David Welter, to join in the scheme. Welter was seen as a very dull-witted man, but he had a good relationship with Mr. Hendershot and was engaged to the Hendershot's daughter. The first person they considered for their scheme was Patrick Fitzpatrick. Patrick was known in the community as Pat the Diver. He took to alcohol often and found himself in trouble with the law on countless occasions. From April until June 1894, Hendershot made several attempts to insure Pat, treating him at the Penwarden House in St. Thomas. Though their plan had failed, Pat was turned down on medical grounds for being insured. Welter and Hendershot would have to find another victim instead. Not long after John Hendershot persuaded his nephew William to take out a policy on his life. Welter and his puppeteer arranged that John would travel to Eden to visit family, while Welter took William into the Wardell Wood to cut wood. Both men, armed with axes, began their work. As time progressed, William discarded his coat and wristwatch on a nearby stump. Hit by a spell of exhaustion, the young Will Hendershot knelt by a little brook to take a drink. As he turned his back, he was struck on the shoulder. The blow was meant for his head. Stunned, William staggered around in a circle while Welter continued to hit him until he dropped dead. Welter placed his body under a fallen tree. Instead of going to nearby neighbors, Welter walked to his uncle's house 1.5 miles from the scene to report the accident. By the afternoon, the news hit the paper that William Henry Hendershot, who had been living with his Uncle John of Middlemarch, had been killed by a falling tree in Wardell's Woods. The paper stated that William David Welter had said they both had chopped and sawn a tree, and while it was falling, William ran to save his possessions, stumbled, fell, and was struck while in motion. 5 men went to the scene to inspect and found blood splattered everywhere. The very next day, the insurance policy placed upon William was noticed. Sunday after the accident, Elgin County Attorney Donahue and Constable Fairbrother went to the scene to gather evidence. They notified the provincial detective, John Wilson Murray, and when Murray arrived, he exhumed the body on December 18th and removed the head for examination. On December 21st, an inquest was held. The verdict, quote, "According to the evidence produced, we unanimously find that the said William Henry Hendershot came to his death at the hands of William David Welter, and that John Hendershot was an accessory before the fact." End quote. After a second trial in March, at 10:05, March 15th, the new jury reached the same verdict: guilty. What you are about to hear next is from a newspaper clipping of the St. Thomas Daily Times provided by the Elgin County Archives. Quote, "At 10 p.m., night before hanging, Reverend Spencer, their spiritual advisor, was admitted to their presence. The reverend gentleman spent an hour with the prisoners, and it was during this time that they confessed to him the true account of the murder, which generally conceded that any confession made was in accordance with the opinion held all along by the public. At exactly 14 minutes past 8, the souls of William David Welter and John A. Hendershot were ushered into eternity. The day was a perfect one. The sun rose on a clear sky, casting its golden rays across the dewy earth, awakening into ambitious life another day, ushering into existence the last of which the murderers, Hendershot and Welter, should look upon a world of which they had so recently formed a part. Both men were deadly pale. Welter seemed to walk with a steadier tread and had a firm, fixed expression on his face, nerving himself for the last terrible moment. Hendershot was more nervous and seemed to sustain himself with an effort. While Welter maintained a cold silence and walked up to the scaffold, Hendershot was praying aloud and begging the mercy of God." End quote. After the proceedings of Sheriff Brown, Dr. Chamberlain, 3 reverends, Governor Moore, and Deputy Sheriff, the condemned men were placed in position on the scaffold facing south. And again I'll quote from the newspaper. "Both prisoners shook hands with the hangman. Hendershot, looking at the spectators, said, 'Goodbye,' to which a few in the audience responded. Radcliffe, the hangman, quickly adjusted the straps tightly about the legs of the condemned men, their arms having been previously bound, and taking the black cap, first drew it over the head of Welter and dropped the noose over his shoulders. While performing this operation, Hendershot turned and viewed the work. As the hangman drew the knot around Welter's neck, Welter said in a clear voice, which could easily be heard in any part of the yard, 'Too tight, please.' As the cap was drawn over Hendershot's head, he closed his eyes and continued to offer up words in prayer. He then repeated the words, 'Goodbye,' to which Radcliffe replied. The men on the platform were grouped about the men, and as the hangman gave the signal, Reverend Spencer, in a clear voice, commenced the Lord's Prayer. Radcliffe had taken his position to the left of the men. As the reverend gentleman reached the word 'deliver,' the hangman pressed the lever, and at exactly 8:14, the souls of the condemned men were launched into eternity." End quote. A photograph of Mary Lily Hendershot, daughter of the older prisoner and sweetheart of Welter, had been Welter's solace during his confinement. He requested that his picture of her be buried with him. Although this was the first execution in Elgin County, several murders have taken place, and the following are some. James Farwell in Straffordville in 1854. Charles Knight, Yarmouth, 1858. Mrs. J. Murdoch, South Dorchester, 1860. Michael Shaughnessy, St. Thomas, 1861. Chief Needham, St. Thomas, 1870. Albert Bradley, Orwell, 1873. Marshall Pigott, Malahide, 1878. An infant child of Alan Coghlan, 1881. An Italian in a riot in St. Thomas on Good Friday, 1885. Louis Napoleon Stilwell at Eden in 1885. Alex McIntosh, St. Thomas, Easter Sunday, 1883. Fred Glover, Southold, 1893. Roger Allen, St. Thomas, 1893. And William Henry Hendershot, Southold, December 14th, 1894. After seeing this list, it does make me wonder what is going on Good Friday and Easter Sunday. If this week's episode interests you, let us know on our social media. We'd love to make part 2 of Crimes and Tragedies of the Talbot Settlement. If you have more information or pictures of any of the people mentioned in these tragedies, please let us know. Thank you for listening, and come back in a couple weeks for another great episode. Please share the podcast with your friends and follow us on all social media platforms at Backus-Page House. The Backus-Page House Museum and Tyrconnell Heritage Society acknowledges the land we are on today as the traditional territory of First Nations people. As settlers at a settler-focused museum, we value both the significant historical and contemporary contributions of all original peoples and ask how we can be supportive in Indigenous cultural renewal. Life in the Talbot Settlement is a production of Tyrconnell Heritage Society, operators of Backus-Page House Museum. Your host has been Angela Bobier. Music provided by Jack Witmer. And thanks to our producer, Katlyn Reintsma. To make a charitable donation, become a Tyrconnell Heritage Society member, and to contact the Backus-Page House Museum, please visit our website, www.backuspagehouse.ca. Thank you again for listening.